Hello, my name is Jennifer Maloney. I'm one of the professors in fire technology at Santa Ana College with the SACFIT Wellness Program. Today we're going to be talking about cancer, and we will talk about giving cancer the boot. So the class objectives for today are to, first of all, reframe the fight against cancer and how we talk about that. We will define cancer, make sure everyone's on the same page of what cancer is and how it behaves. We'll certainly talk about the risk factors, contributing factors, the prevalence of cancer in firefighters, and most importantly, steps to prevention. So I'll start off with this thought, that the cancer miracle is not a cure, it's prevention. If you think about that, this quote comes from the idea that we cannot treat our way out of this cancer caseload that keeps rising, but the only solution is really a full-scale defense so that nobody suffers the disease in the first place. This comes out of the Harvard School of Public Health and the research that's being done there on cancer. Another way to look at this is that cancer must be framed not just as a curable disease, but equally as a preventable one. We will certainly always need good treatments, good interventions, but we can't just treat our way out of this problem, and so prevention is going to be a key factor. So first of all, I want you to think about these statements here. How many of these can you say yes to? I'll give you a moment to read these on the screen, and these come from recommendations from the National Firefighter Cancer Support Network, such as I regularly wear sunscreen. I wear full PPE throughout an entire incident as well as through salvage and overhaul. Post-IDLH, while still on air, I immediately began gross decon of PPE using soap and water and a brush. Is that something you normally practice? Post-IDLH, my crew and I package our PPE and stow them in an exterior compartment. Is that also something that you practice on a regular basis, or how often? Do you use wipes to remove as much of the soot as possible from your exposed body parts, from your skin, your neck, your arms, your hands, your head and face? And to that end, do you keep body wipes or hand wipes on the rig at all times? Shower within the hour is sort of a campaign that encourages firefighters to shower as quickly as they can post exposure to products of combustion. So do you shower as quickly as you can after exposures? Do you practice leaving PPE out in the apparatus floor away from your living areas in the station as well as at home? And do you regularly clean your apparatus seats, interior crew areas, SCBAs, all of that, but especially after you've had exposure to products of combustion? And the last couple, do you log your exposures every time? We'll talk about that and the importance of that. And do you have yearly cancer screenings for early detection, which is a huge component of treating cancer, catching it early, if not preventing it. So if you think about how many of these you can say yes to, is it at least half? Is it less than half, more than half? Again, these are not just random recommendations, but these are recommendations of best practices that we'll come back and address a little bit later. So first of all, why is cancer so elusive? Certainly, this is one of the most important issues for firefighters right now. We've talked about the leading causes of line of duty death being sudden cardiac death. We've talked about the rise in suicide, but certainly we have to look at the rise in cancer cases. Why is cancer rising in such great numbers? Well, here's the thing. On a broad scale, we as a country have made progress preventing many other health threats. Such as infections. Over the past century, we've developed sanitation practices, vaccines, antibiotics, et cetera. With heart disease, we've had smoking cessation campaigns. We've talked about education that helps people to make healthy lifestyle changes. There's been super effective medical management of risk factors such as hypertension and high cholesterol. However, these types of infections or conditions have very clear points of intervention that respond also readily to lifestyle changes. But cancer is different. Cancer is a much different story in that there are many factors we can't control. And if you boil it down, there are three main categories of risk factors for cancer. It's the environment, it's genetics, and it's your lifestyle. So if you think about those three factors that contribute to your risk for cancer, what do you have control over? Do you have control over your environment? Not necessarily, but you certainly do have control over how you allow the environment to impact you, right? What about genetics? We don't have control over genetics. But what about your lifestyle? Certainly there's all kinds of lifestyle habits and practices that we have a huge amount of control over. So we'll focus on protecting ourselves from dangers in the environment, contaminants in the environment, and we'll talk about our lifestyle practices. But recognizing there are many factors we can't control, and that's a big part of why cancer has been so elusive. So all of these three variables combine to have widely varying outcomes in individuals when it comes to cancer incidence. So let's define cancer and make sure we're all on the same page, mostly because if you understand what cancer is and how it develops and how it progresses and behaves, it makes more sense about why we want to prevent cancer, have early detection, and try to implement treatments as quickly as possible if we can catch it early. So first of all, cancer is defined as the uncontrolled abnormal growth of cells. In addition, part of the definition is that cancer is capable of spreading to other parts of the body through two main conduits. That would be through the blood as well as through the lymph vessels. So a tumor then, by definition, is simply a mass of cells that serves no physiological purpose. However, a malignant tumor is cancer. So those are synonymous. However, a benign tumor is simply a mass of cells that really just doesn't serve a purpose, but it certainly will not grow uncontrollably. They're not particularly abnormal cells that will go behave very abnormally, and it is not capable of spreading. So benign tumor is not cancerous, whereas a malignant tumor is cancerous. And so you can see here the pictures of normal cells become abnormal, and then they multiply and become invasive. And we'll look more at that process here in just a minute. So again, what is cancer? When a cell divides, that's a very normal part of everyday physiological processes. When a cell divides, as you can see in this top picture, it's going to replicate its DNA and then make an exact copy of itself. But cell division is not a perfect process. It's like having a keyboard that's missing a letter. So every time you type and you miss a letter, mistakes happen. And these mistakes are called mutations. A mutation is happening to the actual gene itself. Okay? So when a mistake happens, that cell now, this mutated cell, is going to make an exact replica or exact copy of itself. It's going to have, now you're going to have multiple copies of a mutated cell. Well, say one of those cells mutates a second time in the replication process. Now that's going to make exact copies of itself, and so on and so forth. And so the more mutated a cell becomes, the more abnormally it behaves, the more uncontrollably it divides, and that's when it can develop into cancer. So you have primary, secondary, tertiary mutations, and so on and so forth. So on average, it takes anywhere from just one mutation up to 10 mutations to really develop a cancerous cell. So the sooner we can identify abnormal cells, the sooner we can try to nip cancer in the bud. So cancer also behaves, it wants to sustain itself. So the interesting thing about a cancerous tumor is that cancerous cells will actually summon new blood supply to itself, and new blood vessels will grow to actually feed the tumor. It will supply that tumor with blood and nutrients, creating its own lifeline and improving its tolerance and resiliency. And so, in fact, some cancer treatments target the angiogenesis, or the development of new blood vessels to the cancer tumor itself. So because of the way cancer develops and the way it behaves, because of this angiogenesis that happens, it's very unlikely that cancer will ever be eradicated anytime soon. So again, really developing good methods of early detection and prevention are super key. So one thing that's undeniable, and I know you know this better than anyone, is that cancer is the most dangerous threat to firefighter health and safety today by many regards. An important part of preventing cancer in the fire service is just really learning more about it. So there's some hyperlinks in this video that I will also be sharing via a PDF. So you'll have access to all these hyperlinks. But just a couple basic statistics, so we're all kind of looking at the same numbers here. Firefighters have about a 9% higher risk of being diagnosed with cancer, but a 14% higher risk of dying from cancer compared to the general US population. This is according to research by the CDC, the National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety, or NIOSH. So if you just look at those numbers, I mean, that's just those important numbers, and certainly there is a higher risk, a higher prevalence in firefighters. But something else stands out to me is that 9% or there's a 9% higher risk of being diagnosed, but a 14% higher risk of dying from cancer. So why is the risk of dying from cancer so much higher than just being diagnosed with? And pure speculation at this point, but just something for you to think about. How important is it for you to, again, be aware of changes in your body, being on top of early detection, regular screenings, so that you can catch it early before it becomes invasive while it's still easy to treat, okay? So the cancers that are most responsible for this higher risk in firefighters include these main categories: respiratory type cancers, which include lung cancer and mesothelioma, which we'll talk about in a moment, cancers of the gastrointestinal system, so the oral cavity, so oral cancers, esophageal cancers, cancers of the large intestine, as well as kidney, and I'll include bladder cancer in there as well. In fact, the Boston Fire Department, many of you may be familiar with research that they've done, but they have seen elevated rates of cancers of the brain, lung, colon, prostate, bladder, kidney, and skin in their firefighters. So, I like to say that cancer is not discriminatory. Age, gender, even lifestyle sometimes, and genetics, there's so many factors that cancer can find its way in. So the more that we can be doing to be knowledgeable and aware of our own health status and our own risk and be preventing, the more we can do, the better. So just to put some numbers up here, this isn't anything you need to necessarily memorize, but just if we look at cancers in firefighters relative to the general population, we see some towards the top: testicular cancer, mesothelioma, esophageal cancer, etc., that are seen at higher risk or higher rates in firefighters. Certainly these are because of the things that you're exposed to, which we're going to be talking about next. So firefighter routes of cancer exposure, if you can remember these three things. Essentially, if you're going to be exposed to contaminants that may be carcinogenic, it's either going to be through inhalation, absorption, or ingestion, right? So inhalation from breathing contaminants, whether it's not wearing your SCBA or having an ill-fitting or defective SCBA. Absorption from contaminants going through and around or under your gear and actually being absorbed through your skin. And then ingestion from maybe touching contaminated gear or contaminated surfaces, not washing your hands properly, and then maybe eating something or touching your face or around your mouth. And so if you think about these three vehicles of exposure, inhalation, absorption, and ingestion, what can you be doing? What are some very simple practices that you can start doing on a regular basis that can help to mitigate and prevent and basically cut off and provide a barrier to these three avenues of exposure? So one research I just want to point out, this is looking at just a few select firefighters before and after a burn, and some of the chemicals, carcinogens, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that they were exposed to. And you can see the different body areas, the front of the neck, the back of the neck, the jaw, and the hands, and the different types of chemicals they were exposed to. And what stands out to you, but post-burn, the hands, right? The hands tend to have a lot of contaminants on them, and so the simple act of using hand wipes or washing your hands with soap and water as quickly as you can, being really mindful of that before you maybe go to grab something to eat or drink and put it in your mouth. Exposure via direct contact with the skin or eyes. In the fire department or in the fire environment, every 5 degrees increase in body heat can actually increase skin absorption of chemicals by 400%. So when you talk about absorption through skin, obviously that's a factor, but when now you combine that with being in the fire environment and what happens to your own body temperature, that can actually exacerbate and increase that rate of absorption through the skin. So again, just doing as much as you can to prevent direct contact with the skin or the eyes by wearing your full PPE at all times. So other factors to consider in your individual risk evaluation. So if you look at just your own personal risk, your genetics, your habits. How much of this also comes into play for you individually? So think about the number of years on the job. Think about the amount of time and types of exposures at fires. So how many years on the job? How many years have you been on the floor in operations? Have you served on a hazmat crew? How about wildland strike teams where you're not necessarily wearing full PPE or SCBAs out on the line, but what you're exposed to? How much time just standing around the rig, right, where there's diesel exhaust fumes? What about the intensity of exposures, the number of exposures? You might have had a very brief but very intense exposure. You might have had multiple exposures over time, maybe very early on in your career when you were younger. We don't know if there's a certain window of time when we're exposed to contaminants that may have a greater effect on us, whether it's in our earlier years or later years. That research still needs to be done. And are you logging your exposures, right? Keeping track of that so you have a sense of how many exposures you've had. And what about varying work schedules? Again, hazmat strike teams, different shift schedules, which may increase the number of exposures, may affect your sleep deprivation, which we'll talk about next as well. And certainly there are added layers of complexity in that fire environment, the impact of heat and air temperature and chemical mixtures on the exposure dose at a fire, right? We don't often know what chemicals you're being exposed to and how that can impact the exposure rate. Again, the types of PPE and uniform textiles and other lifestyle factors outside of work, including tobacco use, nicotine use, looking at your sleep habits. I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but recently the World Health Organization has a branch that basically it's a body of researchers that really look at the research to define what is carcinogenic, what is cancer causing in humans. And they have found recently that something called nighttime or shift work, so that includes firefighters, but also law enforcement, medical professionals, et cetera, EMTs, anybody that works shift work, such as public safety, that nighttime shift work is a probable carcinogen. So it's not the highest level of a carcinogenic to humans, but it is a probable carcinogen. And that's because of the effects of sleep deprivation on our immune system and our ability to actually fight cancers, which we're going to look at in a moment. So thinking about your sleep habits, which is a whole other conversation. I know we've had our sleep class with you, but feel free to reach out to us too if you want some more information about ability and habits to get better sleep. Your unique genetic susceptibility is certainly a factor. And then again, cancers can take years to develop or they can develop very quickly. And so is there a prime window of exposure? Is it a cumulative lifetime exposure? Is that super important? Just more research needs to be done so we can understand more. But here I want to show you a picture of a cancer cell in the middle. That's that yellow cell. And then these little blue guys, these are called your natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are part of our innate immune system. It's something that we're born with. And our natural killer cells are the first wave of defenders against infection and disease, including cancerous cells, these mutated cells. The cool thing about these NK cells is they don't require any special training or preparation. They just are ready to deploy immediately. They do their job and then they get out. It's kind of like a Navy SEAL, right? They just they're ready to go. They're at the ready. When they're called into action, they go, they do their thing, they do their mission, and they get out. The one thing that affects our natural killer cell activity is sleep. And even just after one night of shortened sleep, we can actually decrease our natural killer cell activity by over 50%, which is a significant state of immune deficiency. Now, of course, sleep is not always something that you have control over when you're on the job. But again, there are lots of things that you can do, you have control over to help you improve your chances of getting a better night's sleep, better quality sleep, if not more sleep. And again, while that's a separate conversation, we'd love to continue that with you if you have more questions because of the many, many health implications that adequate sleep has, including on your cancer risk. So this is that agency I was mentioning from the World Health Organization, that they are the ones that truly define what is a carcinogen, what is cancer causing in humans. It's called the IARC, or IARC, International Agency for Research on Cancer. In their latest review in 2022, the IARC has classified occupational exposure as a firefighter as quote-unquote carcinogenic to humans. This is a group 1 carcinogenic category, which means that there is the strongest evidence that something can cause cancer. So it is well established through research across the globe that occupational exposure as a firefighter is carcinogenic to humans. The tricky thing with that definition is that that classification, while it's the most significant that you can achieve, doesn't say anything about the level of cancer risk from exposure. So while we know something can cause cancer, this doesn't say that it will cause cancer in any one person. So that's why it's so important for each one of us, each one of you individually, to really understand your individual cancer risk, what you can do and what you can be doing better to reduce your exposure, to mitigate and to prevent, and to continue to be educated. Because we know that your exposures can cause cancer, but what can you be doing to prevent your risk of getting cancer yourself? So a couple things I want to talk about, because these are really prevalent cancers in firefighters that we're seeing more of. Mesothelioma and bladder cancer, or kidney cancers as well. So mesothelioma is a type of cancer that occurs in the thin layer of tissue that covers over the majority of your internal organs. And asbestos exposure is the primary risk for mesothelioma. You can read more about this at cancer.org. If you type in mesothelioma, it tells you a bit more about that. Bladder cancer is highly related to exposure to benzene, as well as tobacco smoke. So anytime you can be reducing, again, your exposures, inhalation, as well as absorption is going to be huge. And again, the bladder cancer advocacy network is another great source for that. So here's another list, kind of a laundry list, certainly not exhaustive, of other chemicals and contaminants, carcinogens, and the different types of cancer that they're related to. Excuse me. More so just to put an exclamation on the statement that firefighters exposed to many occupational contaminants that increase your risk for cancer. So the prevention side is hugely important. So again, that nobody has to suffer cancer in the first place. So one thing I want to connect you with, there is a physician, and he actually used to be a firefighter, but he's also the department physician now for the Boston Fire Department. And over his years of experience of treating firefighters, understanding their needs, because he was a firefighter himself, and he's come to see the shortcomings of preparing firefighters for their specific health needs. And so what he's done is put together a PrEP guide. It's the pre-physical guide for firefighters. So these are some recommendations for you for before you go see your physician. Do kind of a self-assessment for yourself so that you come equipped with good information and accurate information and the right questions to be asking your physician when you go in for a well visit or for a checkup. So if you're thinking about cancer in particular, there are different types of cancers, particularly of concern for firefighters. Skin cancer, cancers of the respiratory system, cancers of the blood. And so these are different signs and symptoms to be looking for, and then potential workup requests or things that you can talk about with your doctor that may be appropriate to screen for these types of cancers. So for skin cancer, we have the ABCDEs of skin cancer. That's an acrostic that helps you remember what are some of the signs and symptoms of a skin lesion that could indicate cancer. Asymmetry of, say, a mole or a mark or a lesion, border irregularities, color variation within the same region of the lesion, a diameter that's greater than 6 millimeters. That's about the size of a pencil eraser head or a little bit bigger than that. Enlargement or change in shape, change in color, or change in symptoms. And all of these would point to the fact that, remember what cancer is. It's a mass of cells. It's cells that are growing uncontrollably and abnormally and are capable of spreading. So if you have cells that are growing abnormally and uncontrolled, you're going to get some of these changes, border irregularity. It's going to grow in kind of all directions, not in a nice defined way, not in a nice defined piece of tissue. In terms of the respiratory system, chronic cough, shortness of breath, chest pain, maybe weight loss, hoarseness, maybe obviously coughing up blood. That's never a good sign, right? So these are some things to think about, like don't dismiss that, maybe that chronic cough or some of that chest pain. Don't dismiss it as something else. Just take note of that and let the doctor help rule out what that might be by doing some recommended workups potentially. Again, for blood cancers, bleeding, fatigue, easy bruising, if your color is pale, dyspnea, so difficulty breathing, fever or night sweats, weight loss, itching, change in your lymph nodes, bone pain, chronic infections, poor wound healing, brittle nails. Any of these could be related to blood cancers, and these aren't necessarily things that would jump out at you and make you think cancer right away, and I don't want you to necessarily think cancer right away, but certainly take note of any of these signs or symptoms that you may be experiencing and talk about them with your physician. A couple other types of cancer categories would be gastrointestinal system, as I mentioned earlier, esophageal and colon, pancreatic cancer, oral cancers, as well as genitourinary cancers of the kidneys, bladder, prostate, testicles for men, and uterine and ovarian cancers for women. So again, these are some of the signs and symptoms to be looking out for yourself. Take note of them, maybe have a journal or a little spreadsheet, even if you want, with the date and any signs or symptoms you've had within that time frame, and keep track of it, right? So again, this is more work on you, but to your benefit, that could be invaluable down the road. And I would recommend starting this type of tracking and observations for yourself as soon as possible, as early in your life as possible, so that you can then have a documentation for yourself to say, hey, you know, these are when some of these signs or symptoms started appearing and at what frequency. And maybe if you can tie that to some exposures, you know, there you've got more documentation for yourself for your own knowledge. And then again, here's also from Dr. Hamrock, same physician, are some recommended annual screenings and annual labs and tests that you would want to have done. The cool thing is that through our wellness program, we do address a good number of these, probably about 25% of these or so. The rest you definitely want to be talking with your physician about and what would be appropriate for you to have either on an annual basis or semi-annual, maybe every 2 or 3 years as needed. And then finally, I do want to point out, kind of bring this back to those recommendations, those best practices that I pointed out in the beginning and asked you if you practice any of these. So these are best practices for firefighter cancer prevention. You can find this actually on the IAFC website as well as the National Firefighter Cancer Support Network. Again, wearing full PPE throughout an entire incident, including your SCBA during salvage and overhaul. Is that a practice that you follow? Is that something that you can change, you can improve? You know, all of these different recommendations, I won't read them off all for you, but I'll give you a minute to take a look at them. Again, this ties right back to that first kind of poll that I asked you at the beginning of this class. What are maybe 2 or 3 practices that you're not currently doing on this list that you could easily start to implement for yourself, for your crew, maybe even across your whole department if that's appropriate? Some of these are just individual practices. Some of these are things you can practice together as a crew and help each other, remind each other, and lower that threshold, lower the barriers to make those practices easy and comfortable for everybody to do on a regular basis. One thing I really want to emphasize and really encourage is fully documenting all fire or chemical exposures on incident reports and personal exposure reports. So I will also share with you a link, the personal exposure report system that is online. If that is something that you can have access to through your department, I highly encourage you to do so. Again, it's invaluable to have that information for yourself moving forward. Heaven forbid, if you do have a diagnosis at some point, it's important that you have that documentation and that log. And even more so just for yourself to understand what your risk is and what you can be doing to further mitigate and prevent. So here's a list of resources. Again, this whole presentation will be shared in a PDF, so you'll easily be able to click on these hyperlinks and access some of these. But the Personal Exposure Reporting System, the PER Online, is a place that if you have access to it and have a free account, which I know many departments do, and I think all firefighters should be able to have access to something like this. But that's something that you have to figure out if that's something your department has available to you. I highly encourage you to utilize that reporting system. Again, the Firefighter Cancer Support Network, IAFC cancer resources, including those 11 best practices for preventing firefighter cancer, that poster that I just shared. That's a colorful 11 by 14 poster. Feel free to put that up in your stations or just save it on your phone so you can easily refer to that. Again, the Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network, because bladder and kidney cancers are a really higher risk now for firefighters, as well as the American Cancer Society has their own kind of link to firefighters and cancer risk for your specific population. So I encourage you to explore some of these resources and find out some more information, maybe find some answers to questions that you've had, and just get information that you didn't know before. So finally, I want to leave you with this thought. Again, we started this class with the thought that the cancer miracle isn't necessarily a cure, but it's prevention. And so really having a strong defense against cancer is super important, and that includes prevention, includes early detection, and it includes effective treatments, interventions, and cures. So for your part, what do you have control over, right? You have control over lifestyle factors. You have some control over how you protect yourself from your environment and the exposures to contaminants in your environment. So what are 3 actions you can take individually to reduce your exposure to contaminants and to reduce your cancer risk? I would refer you back to those 11 best practices for firefighter cancer prevention as a good starting point. Certainly you may have some of your own. I certainly trust and hope that your crew and your department are already implementing and enforcing a lot of these practices already, looking out for each other's best interests. So I encourage you to continue doing that. Make that be the norm. As new firefighters are coming into the fire service, let that be the norm for them so that they can start their career off with a healthy perspective on preventing against cancer. So I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and I encourage you to just step back and take an assessment of your cancer risks. While I'm not a firefighter and I haven't personally been diagnosed with cancer, I've had multiple family members. Both of my parents and 2 of my brothers have all been diagnosed with cancers. My one brother was diagnosed very young, at the age of 16. Another brother was diagnosed first at age 24, and then finally passed away at age 31. So I understand that cancer is not discriminatory. It affects the healthy, it affects the young, it affects the old. But as much as we can be doing to be aware of our risk, genetics and environmental risks, our own lifestyle factors that are risks, things that we can be doing to start to implement and make new changes that help to reduce our risk, reduce our exposures, and certainly log exposures, and very importantly also practice early detection. Use that PrEP guide that Dr. Hamrock recommends to do a self-assessment and schedule an appointment with your physician to get a full workup and take the time, be equipped going into that appointment to take the time to talk with your physician about concerns you have and work on that with your doctor to rule out or to detect anything as early as you can. So we as the college at Santa Ana College are here to support you. If you have any questions or concerns, if there's anything that we can be doing to help you specifically or to help your department, again, in this fight against cancer, in this effort to improve our cancer awareness, education, and prevention, and risk reduction, please let us know. All right, thank you for your time.